Hello, my name is Owen Clayton. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Leeds. I've been for the last 4 years completing my thesis on 19th century American and British literature. During most of that time I've been teaching undergraduates here at the University of Leeds. I've also taught at the University of Lincoln and also at Hertford College, University of Oxford. And also for much of that time I've taught at A-level and at GCSE as well. So I've been able to get a cross-section, to see a cross-section of educational levels, and during much of that time I've been able to see the gaps that are there in the educational system, the kinds of things that students don't actually pick up as they move through the educational system. And that has led me to create the lecture that I'm going to give you today. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about how to create effective arguments. Now, what is an argument? Okay, an argument, if any of you have seen the clip from Monty Python, which is the argument clinic, you'll know that an argument is not simply two people disagreeing. In fact, in that very clip, one of the characters says that an argument is a collective series of statements to establish a definite proposition, that it is an intellectual process. That is a very accurate description of what an argument is. An argument is something that you build up through your essay in each of your paragraphs. The paragraphs are the building blocks, if you like, of your essay, and they work to establish your conclusion. Okay, so this lecture is going to discuss three topics, and the first of those is going to discuss introductions and conclusions. And introductions and conclusions are vital in terms of thinking about your argument. Your introduction is the place where you actually establish your argument, you establish what you're going to say. And then we're going to look at structuring your argument, and it's important to recognise that arguments actually have a structure. And then the final part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about common argumentative flaws. And that part of the lecture might get a little bit technical, but whenever I use technical language, I will try to explain what I mean by that. Okay, so let's look at introductions and conclusions first. Okay, so what do introductions and conclusions do? Surprisingly enough, they introduce and they conclude. Well, okay, what do good introductions and conclusions do? Okay, well, a good introduction, I think, does three things. A good introduction, first of all, goes straight to the topic, it defines the terms, and it arouses interest. The second thing that an introduction does is it signposts the way ahead. The third thing that an introduction does is it provides background. I would say the first two of these are vital. The third is advisable but not absolutely essential. But I would say that the best introductions, and I hope that you want to write the best essays you possibly can, would include all three of these aspects. Okay, so how do we do these? Let's look at the first one. So let's look at going straight to the topic, defining the terms, and arousing interest. Now, going straight to the topic, that is about being assertive in what you say. It's about leaving the nitty-gritty of your argument, the subtleties, the complexities of your argument, to later on, to the actual main body of the essay. Okay, so otherwise you'd end up with a very long, a very wordy introduction. Defining your key terms. Now, defining your key terms is very important because you might, in your question, have key terms that might potentially be defined in different ways. Different people might think of different key terms in different ways. Let's give an example. Say you were talking in your essay about love. Okay, you were looking at a particular poem and you were looking at the function of love. Now, love is something that can be defined clearly in many different ways. It's romantic love, filial love, sexual love, and so on. So you would have to define what exactly you meant by that term for the purposes of your essay. And what you need to do is not just to define a term, but to say how you're going to use that term. Okay, so the definition of that key term is actually important for your argument. Okay. Now, arousing interest, this is a snappy first sentence that you have. This is perhaps a general statement about the topic, which just gets your reader's interest when they're first turning the page. Okay. Let's give an example of the kind of introduction that does the things that I'm talking about. Okay. So this is an example from a fictional essay, and it's an example from an essay in which a student has been asked to talk about the function of ideology in Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations. Okay. So this is our example introduction, and let's go through this. So ideology, like oxygen, is necessary yet invisible. Okay, so there's your kind of snappy first sentence, if you like. It's a general statement about ideology, about the fact that it is everywhere and yet invisible, and it's comparing it to oxygen. So it's a kind of general statement trying to arouse interest. It's a little bit arty. You can have a little bit of fun with it. Okay, let's move on. In Capital, Marx gives this description of an ideological act. We are not aware of it, nevertheless we do it. Okay, so there's your definition, not exactly of ideology, but of an ideological act. Okay, and it's taking it from Das Kapital by Karl Marx. Okay, moving on. Utilising Marx's definition, this essay will argue that the main characters in Great Expectations engage primarily in ideological acts, of which they are unaware, but which their ideology compels them to undertake. Okay, so that is using the definition of ideology as seen in Marx's Das Kapital and saying that you're actually going to apply that specific definition of an ideological act to Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Okay, so it's not just defining your key term, but it's also saying why that definition of your key term is important and how you're going to use it. Okay. Okay, so the second thing that a good introduction does is it signposts the way ahead. And it's important to say that this is, you can think of this like a roadmap, okay? So this is just saying the order in which you're going to discuss certain aspects of the essay. Okay, so let's turn to our example introduction again. And this will be the next sentence following on from the introductory sentences that we've already seen. Okay, in order to do this, I will examine the actions of Pip, Joe, Magwitch and Wemmick in turn. Now, for those of you that have not read Great Expectations, those are characters from Great Expectations. So, simply put, the essay is going to examine each of those characters' actions in turn, and is going to use each of those characters as, if you like, paragraphs. So that is the structure of the essay laid out in the introduction. Now, there are certain things maybe missing with this introduction at the moment, but we'll come to that when we turn to thinking about common argumentative flaws. Okay. So the third thing that we said that a good introduction does is it provides background. Okay. Now, providing background is important because it shows that you have read around the topic. It establishes your credibility as a writer, as a young scholar. Okay. It shows that you've actually looked around the topic and that you therefore know what you're talking about. Okay. Now, background can take different forms. You could have historical background, contextual background. So if it was a Victorian novel, you might look into that. It could be biographical information about a particular author, about Charles Dickens' life. It could be critical background. So this could be giving some of the critical context. How have critics received the novel Great Expectations? Okay. Now I said that this wasn't absolutely essential to provide background, but I think the very best essays will do this, so it's highly recommended. So let's look back at our introductory paragraph again and see how it continues. Okay, quote, "The mid-19th century was a period of enormous social change. The Industrial Revolution reinforced the boundaries between classes, while at the same time perpetuating a bourgeois ideology of individual achievement." Okay, let's stop there for a second. So what we've got here is an opening couple of sentences which provides a little bit, in a very general way, of contextual information for the mid-19th century, which is when Great Expectations is written. Okay, so it's a period of enormous social change. The Industrial Revolution, which creates a working class in which people are working in factories, but it also creates what's called a bourgeois class of people who actually own those factories. So you have an increasing, if you like, a stratification of society into those two different classes. It becomes much, much harder to move from one class, from the working class, up into the bourgeois class. And yet at the same time, there is an increasing ideology of individual achievement, which suggests that you can actually achieve whatever you want as long as you work hard, no matter what class you're born into. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. Let's move on to the next sentence. This meant that there was often a contradiction between the actions of particular groups and the justifications for those actions. Okay, so this is where you see that, this background actually relates to the definition of an ideological act, which we had at the very beginning that we took from Marx. So the background is relevant to the definition of ideology because there is a contradiction potentially between what people do and why they think they're doing certain acts. Okay. So let's move on. We're going to talk now about good conclusions. What do good conclusions do? Okay, well, I think good conclusions do two things. A good conclusion finishes firmly and sums up. Okay, and if possible, a good conclusion also notes further questions. And I would say that number one is vital and number two is advisable. So again, if you want to get have the very best conclusion and write the very best essay, it's best to have both of these things. But number one is absolutely vital. Okay, so how do we do these? Okay, well, number one, summing up and finishing firmly. Well, this is about, simply put, it's about stating what you said in the essay. Okay, so in the introduction you say what you're going to do, in the conclusion you say what you've done. So the conclusion is synthetic, not in the sense of being artificial, but in the sense of a synthesis, in a sense of bringing things together, bringing all the different strands together, and actually making it clear that you've reached your conclusion as a result of the paragraphs that the marker has read leading up to that point. And your conclusion should arise organically from your paper. Okay, so there should be no surprises hidden in your conclusion. The marker should not get to the end and think, oh, that wasn't the conclusion I expected. Okay, it should actually seem fairly obvious to the marker by the time they reach your conclusion that that's what your conclusion was going to be. Okay, well, partly because you'll have already said it in your introduction, but it should make sense and it should arise organically out of the paragraphs and out of the arguments that you've made all the way through the essay. Okay, now finishing firmly, this is the counterpart, if you like, to the strong opening snappy sentence. This is a good strong sentence to finish up at the end, and various methods that people use to do this. You could rework a famous phrase potentially, or use a quotation, or make use of a quotation from the text itself. There's various different ways you can do that. Okay, so what are some common errors that people fall into in their conclusions? Well, I've kind of hinted at one of them already. A very common error is to say that you have proven something in your conclusion that you haven't actually proven in your essay. Okay, so students often get to the end of their essay and you get to write your conclusion and you think, uh-oh, I haven't actually proven what I said I was going to prove in my introduction. Well, never mind, if I just say that I have in my conclusion and it's what I said in my introduction, never mind, no one will notice. Well, surprisingly enough, people will notice. Markers are people who, are tutors at university who mark hundreds of essays. It's what they get paid to do. It's one of the things they do for a living. So surprisingly enough, they will actually notice if you do that. So if that situation arises, you realise you haven't actually proven your point, well, you might need to go back to the essay and rework certain aspects of it, or you may need to slightly change what you said you were going to prove in your introduction. Okay, a second problem that people often have with their conclusions, it relates to the part where you're supposed to finish firmly, is that people quite often fall into preaching. And they quite often make emotive statements like capitalism is evil, or religion is rubbish, or I hate Dickens. Now, you might actually think one or more of those things, and in a sense I'm not too concerned whether you actually do think those things. The point is, well, okay, if you want to critique capitalism, well, then you would need to do that, or rather you might want to talk about the ways in which Charles Dickens' novels critique capitalism, but you would do that in a measured way and you would use evidence from the text. Likewise, if you don't actually think The Great Expectations is a particularly good novel, well, okay, that's fine, but then you would need to provide evidence in the text as to why you would think that, and also as to why hundreds of years of scholarship are wrong as well, by the way. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, the second thing that a good introduction does is it notes further questions. Now, I said that this wasn't quite as important as the other aspects of a conclusion, but I think it's certainly something that you should think about doing, especially if you do actually want to have the very best conclusion possible. Now, noting further questions, students often take this to mean just talking about the things that you haven't mentioned in your essay. And it is that, but sometimes people talk about that in terms of, well, I just haven't had time to talk about X. And that can sound a little bit defensive. So my advice for this would be to talk about further questions that have arisen as a result of you doing your essay. Okay, so as a result of doing the research that is in your essay, there are now further questions. And one of the ways that you might express that is you might say, further research might examine ... and then say whatever it is that the further research might examine. And if you look in academic journals, you'll find that that's what most academics themselves do. And in this sense, your conclusion is a development of your introduction. Okay, so you've actually moved on by the time you get to your conclusion. You're not in exactly the same place. It's not simply a past tense version of your introduction. Okay, you have actually done something in the progress as you progressed through your essay. But in a sense, there has been a point to what you've done. You've actually reached a point that was different to where you started from. So if you have a look in academic journals or in chapters in books, and you'll see how academics themselves do it. And there's certain techniques which people use which crop up again and again. So if you have a look in a journal and see how they introduce and conclude their own work, then you might be able to do that for yourselves. Okay. So that ends the first part of the lecture. I'm now going to move on to talk about structuring your argument. So this is going to be talking about the main body of your essay, okay, your main body paragraphs, which is where you're actually going to provide the evidence and to produce textual analysis and to actually prove your points. Okay. Now it's important to plan this aspect of your essay. Okay, so you'll actually plan out your paragraphs. You will actually know what you're going to say in each of your paragraphs, and you can actually plot that. If you like, it's almost like putting in the skeleton, and then later on when you come to actually write your essay, you'll be putting the meat on the skeleton. So when you come to actually write a particular paragraph, if say you know that it's about Wemmick, who's that character from Great Expectations, then you will know that that's what the paragraph is about, and you can focus on writing that paragraph. That is a much better way round than how some students sometimes do it, is that they don't have a plan and they just make up the argument as they go along. Okay, now that's much more stressful, and you won't be able to focus on your actual writing and your actual textual analysis. So much better if you actually have that plan to begin with. I'd also say it's worth spending potentially a day actually just planning your essay. It's worth spending some real time. Quite often students don't get the marks that they deserve because they simply haven't spent enough time planning. Okay, before you do any writing at all, plan your essay, break your essay down, decide what it is that you're actually going to argue, and then break that down into smaller sections, which then become your paragraphs. Okay, and so you're moving into your body paragraphs, and you can structure these in different ways. Your body paragraphs will be based around a particular topic or a particular theme, or in the example of the essay that we've been using, by character. Okay, and you can structure and order those different paragraphs in different ways, depending on what seems the most logical to you. So different ways you could do that. You could move from general information to more specific information, so you kind of focus down as the essay progresses. Potentially you could go from your weakest argument to your strongest argument. Okay. Another way of doing it might be to go from the counter-argument to argument, so that you begin your essay with the counter-argument, which is perhaps that you're quoting a particular critic who gives a certain view of Great Expectations, and then you spend the second 50% of your essay giving your point of view, which is maybe different. Now, there's lots of different ways of structuring an essay, and the best person who should actually decide that is yourself, because you know what it is that you're going to argue. All I would say, really, is that you need to have actually thought about this. You need to have actually made sure that your structure of your essay actually makes some logical sense. There is some logic to it. You have actually thought about it. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to talk about using critics, because it's in the main body of your essay where you will use critics. And critics are very, very important, and I suppose it's one of the ways in which university is perhaps slightly different to some of the previous forms of education you've had, because it's much more important that you give some kind of critical context for the texts that you are looking at. Now, critical, not that you will not have ever used critics before, but it will not have the same level of importance, perhaps, as it does at university. Now, critical information is really important. Using critics is important because it shows that you've read around the topic, okay? It gives you some sense of authority and credibility. And you can also use critics to actually structure your argument as well, both on a wider macro level and on a smaller micro level at the level of the actual paragraph, okay? Now, sometimes students are a bit intimidated by critics because critics write, I guess, in a particularly academic way, and critics are, in a sense, not usually writing for students, they're normally writing for other academics, and so it can be quite impenetrable sometimes. And for that reason, students sometimes feel a little bit intimidated by critics, and sometimes feel that they have to always defer to what the critic says. The critic is obviously very intelligent and must be right. What I would say is make sure that you're not deferential to critics, okay? You want to use critics rather than being used by them. Okay, and you can use critics in a variety of ways, okay? The first way that you might want to use critics, as I've already suggested, is potentially to disagree with them. Okay, so an example would be, while Eagleton suggests X, I argue that Y is the case. Okay, so you're using Eagleton as a kind of sounding board to go against, if that makes sense. So this is a very good way to structure your argument, as I've already suggested. The second way that you might use critics is to actually agree with them, so to actually support your argument, to lend some critical credibility to a point that you're making. The third way that you might want to use critics, and this is, if you like, sort of an amalgamation of the first two, is to finesse your argument. Okay, while Eagleton is correct about X, his discussion of Y neglects A and B. Okay, so he's not saying, it's not black and white, you're not saying that the critic Eagleton is wholly right or wholly wrong. What you're saying is, he's right about some things, but wrong about others. Okay, and if you like, that's probably the most sophisticated of the three. But what I would say is it's important probably to use a variety of these methods, to use critics in an essay in probably each of these ways at least once. Okay. Okay, now it's important when you're using critics to always give reasons as to why you agree or disagree with them. Okay, you need to provide evidence which will be from your primary material. So it's not good enough to just say Eagleton is right, you need to say why Eagleton is right. Or it's not good enough to say that Eagleton is wrong, you need to say why you think that he is wrong. And it's also important, particularly when you're disagreeing with a critic, that you actually give a fair representation of their views, okay? So you don't want to say that, I don't know, Eagleton argues that the Earth is flat, and then you go on to suggest that the Earth is not actually flat. Now, you'd be right about that, but you wouldn't be giving a fair representation of Eagleton's views, okay? And that will again be picked up by the marker. So you don't want to set up what's called any straw men arguments, where you just set up an argument that no one has actually made in order to knock it down. Okay, so we're talking about the structure of arguments, and it's important to realise that arguments do actually have a structure. They have a conclusion that is built upon a premise, or rather a series of premises. Okay, so let's look at a very famous example from the realm of philosophy. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, and what you can see from this argument is that premise 1 and premise 2 go together to make up the conclusion. Now, this is obviously a very simple version of an argument, and your arguments in your essays will be longer and more extended than this. But nevertheless, your arguments will have the same basic structure. It's almost mathematical, you know, premise 1 plus premise 2 equals the conclusion. Okay, so how do you know that you actually got a strong argument and that your argument actually works? Okay, so your argument is valid so long as it follows two conditions. So firstly, your premises must be correct, okay, they must be true. So if the first premise in the example we looked at was all men are immortal, then clearly the conclusion wouldn't work because that isn't true. The second condition is that your conclusion must follow on from your premises. Okay, so if the argument that we looked at is all men are mortal, Owen is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, well that is true, but it's not actually been proven by the argument. The premises don't actually lead to the conclusion in that example. Okay, now let's turn back to the example of the Great Expectations essay that we've been looking at, because this might give us an example of how this would actually work. So the student would need, in the Great Expectations essay, to analyse each of the characters' actions to prove that they act ideologically. Now remember, ideologically according to the definition of an ideological act, which we saw from Marx. So that would be each of the paragraphs. We'll go through the different characters and would show the ways in which characters act ideologically. The second thing that this essay would have to do is it would have to make sure that the conclusion follows on from the premises. And one of the aspects of this would be, well, are the characters actually representative of the novel as a whole, or are there any potential gaps? Well, actually there are some potential gaps, because if you think about the novel Great Expectations, or for those of you that haven't read it, there are actually many female characters in Great Expectations. Miss Havisham is a famous example, and this essay hasn't said that it's going to talk about any female characters. So what is that suggesting? That only male characters act ideologically and female ones don't? So that is potentially a problem. Okay, so now we're going to look at the final section of the lecture, which is common argumentative flaws. Okay, so let's look at different argumentative flaws. These are things that you might, potential traps that you might fall into, so they're things that you need to be aware of and to make sure that you don't do. Now, the first one is failing to consider other sides of the argument. You could argue that this is a form of indoctrination. It's like you've got blinkers on and you don't want to look either left or right. Now, this could be the case, for example, if you're trying to make a particular political point. Now, there's nothing wrong with writing political essays, but you do need to make sure that you're considering other points of view and that you're not letting a particular political philosophy actually affect your essay, to make sure that you're not turning it into propaganda, for example. Now, the second argumentative flaw that people fall into is not actually providing any evidence to back up their claims. So this is the difference between an assertion and an argument, okay? Both are saying that something is true, but an assertion merely states that it is true. An argument backs this assertion up with evidence. Okay, so that's the difference. The third common argumentative flaw is unsupported generalizations. And I would just, to give a generalization, I would just say that you should never generalize, okay? Because even if your generalization is true, quite often you end up not providing any evidence, whereas it's always better if you're providing evidence and you're as specific as possible. Okay. The fourth common argumentative flaw that students often fall into is what's called conflation. Now, conflation is a technical term that you may not have heard before. It means the combining of different ideas together so that you pretend almost that they are the same thing. And often these ideas are related ideas, and they might be quite similar ideas, but nevertheless they are still distinct. Okay, they are not the same thing. So, say if you want to prove point A is true, but you don't actually have the evidence to show that point A is true. You do, however, have the evidence to say that point B is true. Now, point A and point B, they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close, and there's definitely a relationship between them. So what some students will try and do in this circumstance is they will conflate point A and point B. And they will say B, in other words, A, or B, that is to say, A. Let's have a look at how this would work in our example essay so that it makes a little bit more sense to you. Okay, so let's look at an example of conflation from the essay that we've actually been using as an example. So this is an example of conflation. 19th century literature, or in other words, literary realism, is more concerned with objectivity than is the modernist literature of the early 20th century. Okay, now what the two terms that have been conflated here are 19th century literature and literary realism. Now, those two terms are related, okay? There was a lot of literary realism during the 19th century. However, not all literature in the 19th century was literary realism, and there certainly is literary realism after the 19th century, so they are not the same. So what this paragraph has done has conflated the two, and it seems to suggest, or it's arguing, that 19th century literature as a whole is more concerned with objectivity than is modernist literature, which is quite a shaky claim, and much more shaky than saying literary realism. Okay, so the fifth common argumentative flaw I want to discuss is what's called begging the question. Okay, now begging the question is where you have an assumption buried into what is a premise that you are using to try to prove your conclusion. Okay, so it's when you've got a conclusion hidden within the premise, and when a statement that is only presumed to be true is used to actually back up an argument. Okay, a famous and somewhat misogynistic example of this would be if somebody came up to me and asked, "Are you still beating your wife?" Now, there is no way that I can actually answer that question that doesn't in some way incriminate me. Now, clearly if I say, yes, I am still beating my wife, well, that's not very good. And if I say, no, I'm not still beating my wife, well, that's not very good either, because it suggests that I have, at some point in the past, beaten my wife. That question is begging the question. There is an assumption built into the question. Now, clearly that example is not going to be in your essay, but you can often tell when you're begging the question because you use certain stock phrases. Now, one of those stock phrases would be, "We must remember that such and such is true." We must remember that Margaret Thatcher was the greatest Prime Minister we've ever had. Now, the issue with that phrase, "we must remember that," is that it assumes that your reader already agrees with you. Okay. Another potential phrase that you might use is, "It is obvious that X is the case." Okay? So it's obvious that Margaret Thatcher was the greatest Prime Minister ever, or it is manifestly clear that Margaret Thatcher was the greatest Prime Minister ever. What those phrases do is that they negate the need for you to actually provide evidence. Now, again, it might be the case that, well, I don't know, maybe Margaret Thatcher was the greatest Prime Minister ever. Regardless of that, you still need to provide evidence to support your claim. Okay, so there's a series of questions that you need to ask your work. Are both my introduction and conclusion clear? Is my argument consistent? Have I contradicted myself at any point? Is the argument logically structured? Are my premises correct? Have I backed them up with evidence? And do my premises support my conclusion? Now, if you can answer yes to all of these questions, then you can be sure that you will have created an effective argument. Thank you for your time.